Good afternoon, Naledi. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon. We've got, for the interview this afternoon, we've got Naledi Khabo, who's from the African Tourism Association, based at the moment in New York, but soon going back to South Africa. Naledi, how do you see the issue of tourism and racism?
First, Harold, thanks very much for having me and allowing me to share your platform. I think first, just in terms of talking about racism as a construct, a lot of time when I think about racism, I think about sort of an institutionalized construct. And I think where tourism comes into play, it's more institutionalized prejudice than racism. And I only say that because when you look at the stakeholders across the industry, I don't think that there was ever an intent to sort of exclude. And so when I think about racism and institutionalized racism, that's what I think. I think there was an original intent to exclude, but I think that what's happened is over time, blind spots have developed. And so what happens is there's a lack of diversity in terms of the key decision makers. There's a lack of diversity in terms of marketing messages. There's a lack of diversity in terms of audiences that are targeted across the industry. And it's only now, I think, especially coming out of the Black Lives Matter movements here in the US, that there's sort of been this global reckoning across all industries in terms of really taking a look at what are your diversity and inclusion efforts as it pertains to race and of course other things, but in terms of racism specifically, who are your key decision makers? I'm looking at events, I'm looking at speakers and things like that. And there's just a ridiculous lack of diversity, and most surprisingly across African destinations or topics. As a South African, despite this very American accent, I think I came into the industry thinking that I'm finally going to work in a space that is much more diverse and I'll see more people like me when I walk into a room. And what I found is that whether I'm walking into a room in the US, in the UK, a lot of times those rooms were filled with people who did not look like me or who were not Africans, right? Outside of sort of the key destination leaders. And so to me, that was an immediate disconnect. When I'm looking at sometimes conferencing or I'm looking at stakeholders talking about specific topics as it pertains to African destinations and I don't see any brown faces, that's concerning to me. Because to me, that's lack of effort or lack of awareness. You looked at this panel and I may be hypersensitive, as someone who's grown up Black in the United States and having had to have moved here because my family went to an exile during apartheid, I would argue that I'm probably very sensitive to sort of those type of things. But I look at that. I look at it and I think you looked at this panel or you looked at your participants or you looked at this room and you thought that it was okay. Or, for industry leaders who are engaging buyers and press from across the globe, you looked at this room and you saw that there was no one or maybe one of color and you thought that that was okay. And that didn't ring an alarm. And I liken that to what I've mentioned to you in the past, just in terms of this innocent ignorance. It's you're ignorant to the blind spot we have. And so I don't think it's intentional. And so that's why I almost say it's more institutionalized prejudice versus racism, but it still needs to be addressed.
Is innocence an excuse then?
It's not an excuse, it's an explanation. Because I think it's an explanation because I think people come up sort of doing what they've always seen being done. I think no matter what industry you're in or what we're talking about, whether it's your strategy, you're sort of employing the same strategies you always have. So even within the industry, I think people are so used to doing things the way that they've always done that they're ignorant to the need to change. It's not okay. It's just an explanation. And I only say that as an explanation because I don't think there's malicious intent. And so I can explain it a way that it's not malicious, but now if you don't change it, then it becomes malicious. Like now that you've become aware of it and that there's no direct or decisive action to address it, now we're talking about a different story. Now the innocence goes away and now we're talking about this is malicious and you want this status quo to remain. Or I've had the opportunity, because we've had a lot of talks around diversity recently, and I've engaged with even some members of ATA who've said to me, why do we have to keep talking about diversity and race? It's better, more problems incur. It's better if we don't talk about it. And I'm like, that there is a problem. And if you think that that's okay, that has to be addressed. And so to me, that's not innocent anymore. That is, you are fine with the status quo, which I personally have already stated that it's not okay. The communities have stated that it's not okay. And if you are still okay with that, then that is malicious and that is racist.
But Naledi, we've not talked about why people hold on to that, have we? And that's presumably, or at least in my view, that is to do with the use of power.
Right. I was going to say power and fear. I think it's fear of the
loss. The
loss.
reason that people hang on to it is because it empowers them over other people.
Correct. I know, I completely agree. And I think that there's this fear that if this arena all of a sudden becomes more diverse or more inclusive, then what is my standing? Then I lose my standing, I lose my power. I liken it to sort of opponents, and this is not to go down this rabbit hole, opponents of affirmative action who argue, I'm going to lose my position to a less qualified individual, so to speak. That only happens if the people in power are being lazy and don't put any effort into recognizing and identifying talent. And that happens sometimes. That's a cop-out. The reality is those type of institutions have been put in place because of long held, blockades that have, prohibited people from advancing in whatever their respective industry. And so I think even within tourism, there is space for everyone to grow. But to your point, there's fear. What does that mean for me? If I'm not a member of this community that is sort of banging on the door for inclusivity, are they going to push me out? And am I going to lose business? Is everyone now sort of, going to want to just sort of do business with these certain type of groups and things like that? And I would argue there is so much more room. As audiences grow, the industry will grow. And I think if people more so saw it in that way, that we are all in this together more than ever, especially this industry, coming through COVID or as we continue to deal with COVID, I think that they would recognize that there's more of a benefit than, harm in terms of embracing diversity.
And of course, the other group who've had this thrown at them or suffered from it were women with the women's movement. Exactly the same thing said by men who were in positions of power, who quite clearly tried to prevent women rising up through the ranks. I think that's true. But can I come back to something you said some while ago now, which is about laziness? And let's call it inertia. Because when I look, for example, you're from South Africa originally, and you're going back there. When I look at the South African tourism product, I think it's actually tired. And it's tired because still one of the main attractions in the Cape is the wine route and the garden route. Now, when that was developed during the apartheid period, that was quite an innovative product and people were interested in it. But now I can do a wine route, virtually I can do a wine route in Faversham, from Faversham where I live in Kent, in England. It's no longer a particularly exciting product. And some of the experiences I've had on that wine route recently have been really, well, frankly, boring, grim. And yet there's so much more to Africa than that, isn't it? And in a way, the product has just stayed Table Mountain, the wine route, elephants, still very much the model for South African tourism.
Well, I think not just with South Africa, but I think even destinations across the continent in general, when people think about Africa as a whole or as one, they typically just think about, safari and beaches, and that's sort of the continent's offering, so to speak. I think when you're talking specifically about South Africa or any other destination, the key is to how do we innovate? One, don't throw away products that have been tried and true, but I think that there's a more interesting way to present them as well. So while, you're talking about the wine route experience, there's probably another more dynamic, interesting way to explore that route, or even the safari product. I have probably been very clear when I first came into ATA about we have to get beyond the safari conversation. That doesn't mean throw away the safari conversation. Is how do we look at it differently in a way that will be more interesting? And how do we make safari more interesting to more diverse audiences, whether we're talking about millennials or whether we're talking about the diaspora? So I think that you can still innovate amongst those sort of traditional or older products that have always been positioned, but then you have to then add those additional products. The urban hubs, there's so many cultural products. There's such a strong art scene. There's a music scene. You know, African fashion is just taking the worldwide stage. Those are other sort of touch points that people want to connect with. And when you think about it, whether it's South Africa or any other destination across Africa, what draws individuals' interest, especially, you know, non-Africans, is usually through film, it's through music, it's through fashion, it's through all of those things. And so I think that as we're looking at how do we sort of reposition products or introduce new products, it's looking at what are people responding to, what have they been saying? It's sort of listening and reinventing. But I think it goes back to what I was saying, even when you're looking about how the industry does things that the way that they've always done. That's what's always been done. That's how we've always marketed. We've sort of always marketed to the same audience groups. So I do think that because of COVID and the pause, it gave DMOs, it gave, you know, tour operators, it gave organizations such as ours an opportunity to sort of reevaluate our value proposition, our product offerings, and think about how can we do things a little bit differently. I think now it's actually a matter of survival. So I think you will see a shift in marketing messages, not just from South Africa, but I think from other destinations across the continent in terms of how they're positioning tried and true products and how they're positioning new products that are going to appeal to new audiences.
I hope you're right. I really do hope you're right.
I believe that I'm right, because I truly believe it's a matter of survival.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I just hope that it lasts beyond this period. That's all. I think it's really important. One of the things that frustrates me enormously about Africa, actually, it's about perceptions of Africa from outside of Africa, is the frustration. People will talk about going to Africa on holiday as though you can go to Africa on holiday. You can't go to Africa on holiday. It's a ludicrous idea. You can go and visit quite a lot of Africa if you're wealthy and you fly around a lot, but in the main you go and see a tiny fragment of a massive continent. And we know that Africa is the most diverse continent on the planet, both in terms of its geography, its people, its cultures, and so on. It's ethnically the most diverse continent as well. And yet young people go to Indochina and they go to the Far East to see cultural diversity. How has that been allowed to happen?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to the question you just asked me in terms of marketing and positioning. We haven't marketed the cultural offerings. To your point, people are going to other regions. It's a lack of awareness. One, Africa as a continent is so vast. I don't think that there's a clear understanding about how vast and how diverse Africa is. And the onus is on destinations, organizations such as ourselves to sort of take the lead in that education or amplify the messaging that's there so people can truly understand and appreciate how diverse and how vast Africa is. When they're talking about, you know, I'm going to Africa. No, you're going to South Africa. Are you going to Kenya? And, you know, even just look at South Africa. That's so diverse.
Can't really go to South Africa,
can't even go to South. Exactly. It's so different. Languages, culture. I mean, you know, all the different tribes, so many things. But that's not clearly communicated or celebrated. So I think that sort of has to go into the marketing messages as well at a higher level, just in terms of let us help you understand just everything that Africa has to offer. And to your point, what are all the cultural events? There's so many ridiculously amazing cultural events all over the continent, celebrating various tribes, celebrating various events and things, and that's not communicated. And I think those are touch points that people would be interested in engaging in. And there's other just really fun events that are around fashion or sport and things like that aren't on people's radar, that people will travel to experience those events in certain destinations. And so I think, again, it goes back to taking another look at how we're positioning individual destinations, how we're positioning the continent as a whole, because I do think that the majority of people just, well, I'm going to Africa, and you'll correct them or I'll correct them. And they recognize that, you know, they're going to another country, but I think it's just still so ingrained in their mind that they just see it as one entity. And it's an uphill battle to sort of get them to shift that focus.
But even when they get to Africa, I mean, I said to you before, probably the two countries in Africa I've been the most to are the Gambia and South Africa. One of the biggest and the smallest in the Gambia. The Gambia has 10 identifiable tribes. in a really small area of land. And with a little effort, you can actually experience the food and so on, and the cultural life of those 10 groups. Now, where else in the world would you find that? You might find it in a big city if you went and met with all of the groups in the big city. But to be able to do that at the African level is an extraordinary opportunity. And yet we go on talking about brand Africa as though it was a place.
Well, you know what? I think that's the difficult part. So people, because the reality is so many individuals do think of Africa sort of as this one unit. And when anything bad happens on the continent, it happens to the entire continent. So I think you could almost apply the inverse principle. If anything good happens, it impacts the rest of the continent. So I think that when positioning brand Africa, that's the intent, is sort of how do you build on the positive sentiment and sort of spread that across the continent. But the challenge is, how do you do that? Talk about brand Africa while still making sure you're educating the public at large about the diversity that Africa has to offer, and how individual each country across the continent is. It's a challenge because you still want to engage people where they are, as in anything, right? You want to engage people where they are and deal with the reality of where they are. So if you can positively sort of engage with them with this understanding, I understand why that's an approach. Then again, the challenge just becomes, you know, how do we really reinforce the diversity? Because I see it work. I do see it work. I think that there's an increase in Africa in general because of the brand Africa concept. I do think that when people see positive things happening, whether it was a beyond the return engagement in Ghana, that had a positive effect on other countries across the continent. When people are just likening sort of Afrobeats as African music in general, that positively impacts more than one destination across Africa. So I think you can still leverage that idea of brand Africa to your advantage or to a destination's advantage. It just becomes a trickier proposition because you still have to, while reinforcing this positive overall sentiment, you still have to drive home how diverse it is, how diverse every country is within the country, let alone across the continent.
Thank you, Naledi. Can I, just as kind of final question, can you just maybe mention 2 or 3 things that if we went out and did them tomorrow would make a big difference to reducing racism in tourism?
Okay, so I think from an industry stakeholder perspective, it's making a concerted effort to make sure every conversation is more diverse and inclusive. That means not necessarily having the diversity conversations, but making sure every conversation is diverse. I don't want to have the Black conversation, but there should be a Black voice on the conversation about sustainability or accessibility or about luxury or about the LGBTQ plus, pillars. I think changing marketing messages and images, that's a significant difference. When people see themselves reflected, this is a fact. This is not, a proposition. When people see themselves reflected, they are more inclined to make travel decisions based on, on those images and on those messages. And I think also, so that's about marketing. It's about diversifying the products that you're promoting to more diverse markets. And I think you will clearly see an uptake. And then I think, obviously, I know those are the key 3 things. I think on a longer term perspective, you still have to address like visa policy and connectivity and things like that. But that's not something that you can do tomorrow. But those 3 things you can do tomorrow, today. You can start that now. Like, I'm constantly looking at things and I'm like, this is a problem already. How are we still having this problem when we've been going through this sort of reckoning for the last few months and I'm still seeing like lack of diversity? I'm still seeing the lack of inclusive conversations. It's like we've sort of reverted back. There was that sort of big rush of activation and conversation, and then we've now gone back to our old habits.
Naledi, thank you very much for your time. That was a fascinating interview. And I look forward to talking to you again for WTM Africa, I'm sure.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you very much indeed.